I don't know how all these things are going to work out today. I don't know what the answer will ultimately be to the things that have been worrying me, but I know this: you're sufficient to handle them. I'm not. You're sovereign over my life. I'm not sovereign. So I'm going to trust you today.
Well, welcome again to the Straight Truth Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Philpot, and we're glad you joined us for this episode. Now, we'd love to have you engage with us on this topic, and you can do that by going to one of our social media channels. You can find all of those listed at our website, straighttruth.net. Now, remember that Straight Truth is a listener-supported podcast, so if you'd like to continue to help us produce this podcast, you'll find those details also at our website. Now, lastly, help us spread the word about the podcast, and you can do that by leaving us a review in the iTunes podcast section. Well, Pastor, our next question from a listener again is sort of a response to one of our previous episodes. In one of our previous episodes, we spoke about increasing our faith, something you had addressed, especially the disciples' request, Lord, increase our faith. How do we actually do that? And this listener says, at one point you say, you can't ask God to do something and then not work in coordination with what He's ordained in order to answer your request. And so they want to dig a little bit deeper into that response you made. What does working in coordination with God entail? Is it obedience, or is it something more like personal instruction?
Well, faith is a response to truth. And that faith is always in response to the truth that God has revealed about Himself and about His will. So to increase our faith, what I mean by acting on our request involves both instruction and obedience. If I'm asking God to increase my faith, well, then I need to know the truth about what I should believe and about how I should live. That involves study. It involves being a good listener to sermons. It involves reading my Bible. It involves personal instruction, getting with believers who are older in the Lord than I am and know more than I know. And so I've got to be willing to learn if I want my faith to increase. In fact, some of what people call faith isn't faith at all. It's confidence in things that aren't true. So, and that's misplaced faith. That's misinformed faith. What I want is a well-informed, mature faith, and that means I've got to study. But then it also means I act on what I learn. To ask God to increase my faith, let's say I'm struggling with anxiety, and I'm taught in Matthew chapter 6 to trust the Lord by seeking His kingdom first, and He'll take care of all the things that make for my daily provisions. To believe Him in that area would be to remind myself of those truths in the morning and say, Lord, by your grace today, I'm going to set my mind on you. I don't know how all these things are going to work out today. I don't know what the answer will ultimately be to the things that have been worrying me, but I know this: you're sufficient to handle them. I'm not. You're sovereign over my life. I'm not sovereign. So I'm going to trust you today. I mean, so you have to act on the things that you're asking God to strengthen you in.
Does this mean that God will actually ordain scenarios that will answer our requests?
I think that, yeah. I mean, obviously our God is sovereign. He has ordained scenarios that answer our requests. God puts us into the pressure cooker. He puts us in situations where we are taught to trust Him. In fact, one of the things, if we're all honest, I think embarrasses all of us is how often we worry about things, we find ourselves anxious about things where God has already proven Himself so many times before in our lives. I think about finances. You know, how often we're concerned about finances when time and again God has supplied for us in ways that we didn't see it coming. We didn't know how He was going to do it, but He did. John Piper talks about this in his book, Future Grace, that all of God's past graces to us are down payments on the future in a sense because He doesn't change. The same God who has proven Himself faithful in our past is the God we meet with today, is the God who holds our future. And so we just need to remind ourselves of God's faithfulness to His people throughout the Scriptures, and then God's faithfulness in our own circumstances throughout our lives. when has he ever not been faithful?
Right. Yep.
And if we can remind ourselves of that, it helps us.
I guess a related question to this is when we go to a book like the book of James and think about asking requests of the Lord, and as the old King James says, we should not ask amiss, right? But when we ask, we should ask within the will of God and what He's revealed in His Word. So maybe speak to this idea of God ordaining not only the request, but the answer to the request, and then our asking of it. I guess the fear is like, are we asking something that's in accordance with His will or not?
And that's why study is so important.
Okay.
I may not have a black and white verse of Scripture for everything I'm praying about.
Right.
Let's say I own my own business and there are 3 jobs out there, and I'm wondering which one I should take if I have the opportunity to take all 3, and my crews can only handle one of these, for example. I mean, you're not going to find a verse of Scripture that says take offer A. Mm-hmm. But there are principles that I can bring into the picture as I pray about these things. If the 3 jobs, one of them is going to provide me time with my family and allow me the freedom that I need to be able to serve my church well. I mean, those are the sorts of principles that come into play on decision making. Mm-hmm. In terms of what I'm asking for, does it accord with the will of God? That comes from a knowledge of Scripture that's broad.
Right.
And so I've got to study to know these things. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is it means it's so important that we know the whole of Scripture.
Right.
We aren't the sort of Christians that take nuggets here and there and memorize them and sort of use them just whenever it's convenient for us, but that God has given us an entire worldview from which we can make these decisions.
Excellent, Josh. That's exactly right. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You put it very well. And I think this is why many believers are suffer as they do and struggle as they do. That they have been content with that nugget-taking approach to Scripture instead of allowing their minds to be saturated with the whole of Scripture that does produce a worldview by which you're able to test life and discern what the will of God is and what's right and wrong in any given situation. And even when we're in doubt, at least we know we're in the ballpark, right? I don't know if God is going to be your will for me to do this, but I know what I'm asking for doesn't violate your will.
Right.
And so all of our requests need to be open-handed if it's your will. I know this falls within the realm of that which wouldn't displease you, but I still hold this loosely. If you choose not to give this to me, then I am content with that because I truly believe that you know what's best and you love me perfectly. And I can rest then in whatever the answer proves to be in terms of how it works out. You know what's best and you love me.
Well, thanks again for joining us for the Straight Truth Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Now remember to please share this episode with friends and family, and you can find links to all of our social media channels again at our website, straighttruth.net. Now also, if you would like to hear sermons related to the topic we've discussed today, you'll find links to those in the description below. Now, Straight Truth is a production of Walking in Grace Ministries, which is the preaching and writing ministry of Pastor Richard Caldwell. And you can find more details at walkingingrace.org.